From its headquarters in New York, an exclusive United Nations telecast. Spotlight on Statesmen. Today, Francis O. Wilcox, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, steps into the spotlight to reveal the United States' attitude on the major issues confronting the United Nations. He will be questioned by a distinguished panel of UN correspondents. Eric Britter of the Times of London, Joseph Lash of the New York Post, Vladimir Ozerov of TASS News Agency, George Wolff of Agence France-Presse, and our moderator, Stanley Burke of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Mr. Secretary, you're a former university professor for 10 years. You were Chief of Staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and for the past 5 years, you've been Assistant Secretary of State for United Nations Affairs. You've flown down today from Washington for this interview, for which we thank you very much, to take a look back at this 14th Assembly. First question from Joseph Lash of the New York Post.
Sir, at about the time this assembly began, Mr. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, came over here for a visit, and at that time you said that he had it within his power to bring about on the part of the Soviet delegation at the assembly a more cooperative attitude and thus impart new vitality to the United Nations. I wonder if, in light of the Soviet record at this assembly, whether you feel that there has been a more cooperative attitude on the part of the Soviet Union in the past few months.
That's an interesting question, Mr. Lash, and a somewhat difficult one. It's rather difficult, perhaps, to answer in a brief and summary form. I think the Assembly this year has been characterized by a somewhat better working relationship between the Western powers and the Eastern powers, so-called, than has been the case in most assemblies. One of the highlights, I think, of the Assembly action was the unanimous decision with respect to the resolution on disarmament. Another was the successful conclusion of the discussions with respect to the Outer Space Committee. These two things, I think, do constitute progress and do indicate, to a certain extent at least, that the attitude of the Soviet Union has been somewhat better with respect to the United Nations matters. I may say, however, that of the things that I suggested at the time I made that speech, things that the Soviet Union could do, Mr. Khrushchev had it within his power to do, if he wished to make the United Nations a more successful instrumentality for world peace. A good many of most of them, of course, have not been done, nor did I expect them to be done very soon.
Vladimir.
Mr. Secretary, as I understand from your answer, that up to the General Assembly session, I mean the previous one, 14th, only the Soviet Union was blamed for faults, and I mean that the Soviet policy was considered as tough, not United States policy. You mean that that everything was perfect with American policy and everything was bad with the Soviet one?
No, by no means, Mr. Ozerov. I certainly would not say that everything that was wrong with the United Nations was due to Soviet intransigence. I would say this, however, since you put the question very directly to me. When we started the United Nations, I think we had the feeling in this country, and we held it very strongly, that the United Nations would be the best guarantee for world peace if the great powers could cooperate within the framework of the United Nations. Now, shortly after the organization was created, the Cold War began to develop, and the cleavage between the East and West became deeper and wider. And for that reason, the United Nations has not been able to function perhaps as effectively as some of us would like. And I think that certainly a good portion of the blame for that intransigence can be put on the Soviet Union for its unwillingness, for example, to support such things as a United Nations peace force, or its unwillingness to contribute more to the economic and social work of the United Nations. And I could list a number of things that the Soviet Union has not done. I didn't come here to be critical particularly of the Soviet Union, and indeed I did not start out that way. But you asked the question, and I'm merely trying to answer it.
Mr. Secretary, it has been suggested here that at a time when the United States and the Soviet Union seem to be coming closer together, that perhaps ironically, the organization is more and more being influenced by the Afro-Asian nations. Perhaps there'll be 100 members in the UN before very long. Is there a danger that the United States might tend to withdraw in part from the organization, to downgrade the United Nations?
I don't think we should, certainly I would be very much against withdrawing from the United Nations. The extent to which countries are willing to place its reliance upon the United Nations will depend upon the willingness of the states members of the organization to act responsibly. Now, I see no reason why the Asian and African countries, as you mentioned particularly the African countries, should not act responsibly in the United Nations. Indeed, I think it is to their interest to act responsibly, and our relations with them have been very good. The little states, the new states, look to the United Nations for support. They lean on it. Some of them aren't very strong when they start out in this difficult world of ours, and I think they do tend to turn to the United Nations for sustenance and for protection, more or less. So that I don't feel that the influx of these new members is going to constitute any threat to the stability of the organization. My feeling is rather that these new states will recognize their role of responsibility and assume that role in a satisfactory manner. It is possible that in the next 10 years the United Nations may have as many as 90 to 100 members. That's entirely possible. And a large number of those, of course, would be from the continent of Africa. There will be 4 that will be independent during this next year and will probably become members of the organization in 1960.
Isn't there a danger, though, that the United States, as 1 out of 100 members, if she's voted down on a number of occasions, frequently perhaps, may tend to be disillusioned, withdraw a bit?
Well, Mr. Burke, I have always said that if the time comes when the United States finds itself consistently voted down, I think it would be perhaps time for us to re-examine some of our policies and some of our programs. I think that if we're sincere, honest, helpful, and keep always in mind the aspirations of the underdeveloped countries and work with them to help bring into fruition the objectives of the United Nations Charter, to work toward a better life for the peoples of the underdeveloped areas, I think that they will respond and will support the things for which we stand. After all, you know, the purposes and principles of the United Nations, the objectives of the United Nations, are very much the objectives of our American foreign policy. We believe in the renunciation of force for the settlement of disputes. We believe in resolving those disputes by peaceful means. We believe in working together with other countries to lift the standard of living of the peoples of the world. These are things which we have long stood for as a country, and these are things which the United Nations has dedicated itself to.
Eric Britter.
Sir, you mentioned a little earlier that at this last session, the 2 things that were done, you spoke of disarmament and agreement on outer space. Now, in effect, both those decisions were referring the matter to a special committee, and in a sense they were only technical decisions. Nothing was decided except to hand it over to a special body. What I would like to ask you is, do you think that this particular session achieved anything positive or concrete, or did it just mark time?
Well, Mr. Britter, that's a very good question. I think people are inclined very often to be critical of the results of deliberative bodies, whether they be the Senate of the United States or the House of Representatives or the United Nations Assembly or a local town council. They're inclined to be critical of the deliberative process. I don't think the United Nations Assembly is in a position to solve very many of our problems, any more than the Congress of the United States is going to solve and put on a shelf our problems in the field of health or transportation or agriculture. They come back constantly for further review and further action. Now, if the Assembly can lay down certain guidelines with respect to important political matters like outer space and disarmament, and certain economic things like, let's say, commodity prices or economic development, perhaps in the social and humanitarian field, something like the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. If they can lay down those guidelines, and if they can, in the course of 3 months' debate, help clarify points of view and attitudes of mind, this is the main thing, it seems to me, for which the Assembly was created, to be a kind of town meeting of the world. And I don't think it would be well for us to expect that each Assembly is going to wrap up these problems and to solve them in a concrete, specific way.
George Wolff.
Mr. Secretary, there was some talk during the last session of a rather vague entity, which is the United Nations presence, and it has been said that this presence, whatever it is, diminishes the tension and brings about fruitful and peaceful solutions. Now, I would like you to tell us, if possible, what is meant by United Nations presence. Is it what Laos, for instance, wished to have, or is it the soldiers that are in the Gaza Strip, or how could that be made more forceful and be better organized?
Mr. Wolff, the United States Supreme Court defines the term reasonable in different ways, depending upon who's sitting upon the court and what the issue before the court is. Now, the term United Nations presence is a kind of flexible term, I suppose, something like that term reasonable, as the Supreme Court would interpret it. But the fact is that wherever we have had a United Nations presence, in the sense that there have been involved in a situation representatives of the United Nations on the spot, this presence, I think, has injected into troubled situations an element of stability and tranquility. Well, take, for example, the Gaza Strip or the Strait of Tiran area, between the areas in the UAR, between Egypt and Palestine, where United Nations emergency forces are now located. Well, I think that arrangement has worked very well for a number of years, and its work, I think the evidence that it's worked is the fact that you don't really hear much about it. But there aren't the border incursions that there used to be in those areas. Similarly, the injection of a small United Nations force in Jordan was helpful, and in Lebanon, in each case, helping to bring tranquility to a troubled area. And more recently, I think the presence in Laos of first the Security Council Subcommittee of 4, and now more recently the Secretary General's representative, Mr. Tuomioja, who is there now. And I believe, therefore, that the concept of United Nations presence has been a very helpful development in United Nations history.
Do you think, Mr. Secretary, that this would be a good argument in favor of the establishment of an international police force of the United Nations?
Well, sir, I have always been in favor of the development of some kind of a United Nations peace force. When the charter was first formulated, I was at San Francisco, and I helped in the committee that evolved that part of the charter. And I have been disappointed that we have not been able to come to agreement with the Soviet Union as to the kind of force that could be established, where it should be located, who would be in command of it, and the components of such an international police force. Now, more recently, as you know, President Eisenhower, in his address to the special emergency session of the Assembly a year ago, did advocate again the creation of a UN peace force. Now, in this case, I think he was suggesting the desirability of a somewhat more modest attempt to create a force on a permanent basis, perhaps more like the UNEF in the UAR, or more like the UN presence in Lebanon. Some tangible evidence of a UN presence, a UN concept that would be ready to meet any emergency which might arise.
Could it be applied to Berlin?
It could be indeed, if the parties, of course, agreed that that is one method of helping to bring tranquility to the area. That would, of course, depend upon the wishes of the German people and of the authorities in Berlin and the parties interested in resolving the dispute. But it has been suggested as one of the things that might help ease the Berlin situation.
Vladimir.
In the course of debates on general and complete disarmament at the recent General Assembly session, the American delegation revealed that the United States were working on its own proposals in this vital field. Does it mean that the United States will support the Soviet program on disarmament in Committee of 10?
You recall, Mr.
Excuse me, I think we should mention that this is referring to the 10-nation disarmament group, which will meet early next year.
Yes, in Committee of 10.
You will recall, Mr. Ozerov, that Secretary Herter, shortly after the chairman, Mr. Khrushchev, made his speech, said that the United States would support a proposal for complete disarmament, provided, of course, that the necessary steps could be taken to create a satisfactory and effective system of inspection and control. Now, we have put forth a number of comprehensive disarmament proposals, as you know. The main difference between ourselves and the government of your country has been the fact that we have not been able to agree upon the kind of inspection and control system that would be necessary to make sure that the parties in the agreement were actually living up to the things that they undertook to do. And this is, of course, is going to be one of the most difficult aspects of a complete disarmament program. But our government is willing to move as far in the direction of complete disarmament as other countries are, if we can get the kind of an inspection and control system that will guarantee the effectiveness of the program.
Joe Lash.
Mr. Secretary, in a recent report by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, they called for candid recognition of the realities of Red China. It was one sign among many that there appears to be an evolution in American thinking on the subject of Red China. Is there any possibility of an evolution in the thinking of the administration on the position of Red China here at the UN before next year's assembly?
Well, Mr. Lash, the prospects for such an evolution would continue to receive rather serious setbacks if the Red Chinese choose to conduct themselves as they have been in recent months and in recent years, engaging in such aggressive acts as those in Tibet and along the Indian border and against the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. The people talk about the desirability of some evolution in this whole scheme of things with respect to the role of Red China, but it does seem to me if Red China were interested in improving her position in connection with this whole issue, that she would conduct herself in conformity with the principles and purposes of the Charter, which is something she has not chosen to do up to this point.
Sir, but those who talk about a candid recognition of realities are aware of the Chinese behavior in Tibet and Formosa, etc. And I think that their feeling is that having China at the UN gives the UN a chance to influence Chinese behavior, and that precisely because of the aggressive behavior of China, one would want to have it where it could be made to feel the impact of world opinion.
I think you can certainly argue that side of the case very effectively. Personally, before I became involved in active government affairs, I favored the idea of a universal United Nations. But I favor it only on the basis that the members can demonstrate that they do support the purposes and principles of the Charter, and that they are qualified to become members. You recall the membership clause of the Charter refers to peace-loving states and states who are willing and able to carry out their obligations under the Charter. I should like to see countries meet that standard, particularly countries that are not members. I realize that when you talk about Red China, you're not talking about a member in the strict sense of that word. You're talking about the government that represents China in the United Nations. But I really don't think that Communist China has done anything lately to demonstrate that she has met those qualifications which the Charter sets down.
Eric Britter.
So you spoke a little earlier about the achievements of the session as it ended recently. Wouldn't you agree that one of the things that didn't exactly reflect credit on the session was the long deadlock between Poland and Turkey for the last seat on the Security Council? This election, as you know, went to 52 ballots and was only resolved at the 11th hour and the 59th minute.
Yes.
Don't you think that was rather a bad show, and what do you think the UN can do to prevent its recurrence?
I think it was, Mr. Britter. I don't think it reflected a great deal of credit upon the United Nations. I would have preferred to see an earlier outcome of the conflict. As you know, the Polish government, Polish delegation, was not inclined to compromise after the Turks and the Poles had gone through these many ballots. They were not inclined to compromise. And we felt, I'm sure the Turkish delegation felt, that the least that could be expected under the circumstances was a split term with the Turks and the Poles each taking half of that term. And finally, that was, of course, the compromise that was agreed upon.
But Poland led most of the way, and it was obvious that a small majority of the General Assembly would rather have had her in.
Yeah, well, the balloting went back and forth, as you know. Sometimes Turkey was ahead 42 to 37, and sometimes Poland was ahead 41 to 39 or 37 or whatever. And it went back and forth, as you know. We took the view that we had supported Poland for a seat on the Economic and Social Council, and that we have never supported any one country for two important posts like that at one session of the General Assembly. And we felt, under the circumstances, that the Turks, who have contributed to the maintenance of the United Nations force in the Middle East and who have supported United Nations activities of that kind, did, in fact, constitute a better candidate than the Poles, and I certainly have no objection to the Polish candidacy at all.
What about the long-term prospect for settling this Security Council, 11 members?
I think the best prospect for settling it would be to increase the size of the Security Council. You know, we've gone from 1945 down to the present without enlarging the membership of the Security Council. There are 11 members representing 82 countries, now next year 86, and these 11 members represented 51 countries at the outset. Now it is obvious on the face of it that the new areas of the world where the newly emerging states have come to membership, come to independence and then to membership in the United Nations, these areas remain underrepresented. I think the countries of Africa and Asia do deserve a greater representation on the Security Council. I would like to see the membership raised at least 2 or 3 seats, so that all the blocks, all the areas in the world would have more adequate representation. That would be my way of resolving that particular problem.
Vladimir. George, excuse me.
Mr. Secretary, the two main achievements of the past General Assembly, as you said, were the unanimous resolutions on disarmament and outer space. Now, it is well known that those resolutions could become unanimous after secret, or at least discreet, negotiations, mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union. Do you think that is a new aspect in United Nations activity, and would you be of the opinion that this trend should be encouraged and followed?
Well, Mr. Wolff, and here I address my reply to both you and to Mr. Ozerov because it concerns his country. The United States has always been willing to cooperate sincerely and honestly with the Soviet Union in the framework of the organization, and I welcome such efforts at cooperation. I would not think, of course, that the United Nations would move to the point where you'd have all these things, or many of them, settled by consultation between the Soviet Union and the United States as the two great powers. I don't think the UN ought to get polarized that way. The UN, after all, represents almost all the states of the world, and I think that that if you worked on this basis, where you'd have these two countries sitting down to try and work out their problems, this would undermine the role of the smaller countries. And these cases, in the case of disarmament and outer space, I think that the members of the United Nations were very glad to have the United States and the Soviet Union work out a solution to two very difficult things. And it was a kind of omen, perhaps, that in the future the United Nations can solve more problems with the Soviet Union and the United States working more closely together than we have in the past. And as I say, and I repeat it, and I underline it, we have always been willing to cooperate with the Soviet Union and with the other members of the United Nations to try to develop a stronger organization and to try to work towards world peace through the United Nations.
Mr. Wilcox, our time is up. Thank you very much, sir. You're the fourth of our great power representatives, and this concludes our series on this 14th session.
It's been a real pleasure, Mr. Burke, to be with you today.
Thank you, sir.
In an exclusive telecast from UN headquarters in New York, we have turned the spotlight on statesmen. Today, Francis O. Wilcox, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, has revealed the United States' attitude on some of the major issues facing the United Nations. He was questioned by a panel of UN correspondents: Eric Britter of the Times of London, Joseph Lash of the New York Post, Vladimir Ozerov of TASS News Agency, George Wolff of Agence France-Presse, and our moderator was Stanley Burke of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.